Welcome to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, back again with my dear friend and colleague, Gil Rendle. Hi, Gil.
Hi, Lisa. Good to be here.
Yeah. So this season, we're exploring how faith communities can navigate change with wisdom and courage. Our conversations are grounded in Gil's newest work, Reimagining and Remapping the Religious Landscape, Chaos Before a New Ordering. In this work, Gil helps us see the landscape of faith through a new lens, not through the structures of congregations alone, but through the ways people are making meaning in a world that feels increasingly fluid and complex. It's an invitation for leaders to pay attention, to learn, and to imagine new forms of community and belonging that meet people where they are. You can find a link to Gil's full paper on our website or in the show notes. There's also a link to a short 2-page summary designed to spark conversation around your own leadership table. Today's guest has spent his life helping congregations learn their way into new possibilities. Tim Shapiro is the president of the Indianapolis Center for Congregations, where he has served since 2003 after 18 years in pastoral ministry. Before joining the center, he was pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Xenia, Ohio, and Bethlehem Presbyterian Church in Logansport, Indiana. Tim's deep interest in how congregations learn to do new things is reflected in his book, How Your Congregation Learns: The Learning Journey from Challenge to Achievement. He also co-authored a couple of books, Holy Places, Matching Sacred Space with Mission and Message, and Divergent Church. You'll hear us talk about that a little bit. His writing explores themes like positive deviance, theological coherence, and innovation that is rooted in context. In our conversation today, you'll hear some of these very same themes. So, Gil, as you think about your recent work on meaning making and the changing map of faith, what stood out to you in our conversation with Tim?
Lisa, let me see if I can put it in this kind of a context. I mean, the fun that we're having is that we are having conversations with people who are themselves living out there in the new religious landscape somewhere. And so we're really helped by them describing their experience and their perception and everything like this. And what's different here is that Tim has spent all of his life inside of congregations like you and I have.
Yes.
So now we have three people who are trying to understand this new landscape from inside the congregation. And we're talking about how do congregations live in this new landscape. So if there's anything that I hope that folk will hear is, what's it like for three people to wrestle with that and wrestle with each other around that? And what insights come out when you just start to pay attention to language and to stories and to the metaphors that you use and kind of break away from some of the old stuff. So I think it was fun.
And I suspect as folks listen, they'll hear that we're not offering solutions as much as we're wrestling with the issues. And so I hope that actually there are some very real stories and questions that come out of this episode that help leaders and congregations wrestle with their own place in this moment.
Yeah. One of the things I used to love to say when I was doing public speaking on these issues is that my own denomination has been in decline since 1965. And if someone had come up with an answer to that decline, don't you think they would have mentioned it by now?
Right.
And so there's really no answer. It's us trying to ask what's called forth from us.
Yes.
And that takes a lot of wrestling.
I think that's right. And I think we're really trying to, and you do this in your monograph, really trying to change the questions a little bit and change the lens through which we have this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So let's listen to our conversation with Tim Shapiro. Hi, Tim. Thanks for being with us today.
Lisa, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, you bet. So we're going to jump right in. And Let me start by saying that when we were designing this season around Gil's latest monograph, we knew immediately we wanted to bring you into the conversation. And part of it is where your work intersects. So Gil's monograph is a bit of an experiment, if you will, in perception. That is changing our lens from viewing the religious landscape through congregations to viewing it through people's search for meaning. And your work, of course, especially in Divergent Church, describes congregations that are diverging from the traditional models, really in response to the same landscape that Gil is describing. And so here's where I want to start. As we think about the shift from an institution-centered way of looking at the landscape to a meaning-making centered, really to the experience of folks out there who are searching, I'd love to hear you play with that a little bit. And how do you see this shift? And particularly, how do you see the shift changing what church even is today?
Yeah,
Does
thanks.
that make sense?
Yeah, it does
Yeah,
make sense.
great.
Very perceptive and something that I've been tracking in Gil's monograph, and I've learned a lot about it. So appreciate the question. One way I would answer or respond to that is that, first of all, I think I learned a lot and agree with Gil's observation about the congregation and the way in which what may be primary focus of people trying to find a place to belong is that it's around meaning making. And one of the things that shows up some in Divergent Church is that not only is the form of what a congregation is changing, but the very formation of faith is
Mm,
changing. And that certain ways in which we might have thought of congregations aligned with certain doctrines or certain theological worldviews, as that becomes more and more tied to a sense of who I am and where are we in the world, and what I would call existential thinking or meaning making. The very form of belief may indeed be leading the change in what congregations look like, or even if there are congregations the way we think about it in the future.
So can you this notion of faith formation and how we think about that and how that shapes congregations is kind of in the work of congregations today is we keep coming back to this as we think about our work, but also as we have conversations with folks. So I would love for you to say just a little more about how this work of faith formation is now even actually changing the shape of and task maybe of congregations.
Sure.
Maybe the task has been there, but how is it shaping it today? Right.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Lisa. So I can tell a story, and it may not be exactly what you're asking, but it is based on an experience that has resonated with me. I know of a 30-year-old. Actually, when this occurred, it's a young man who was 24, now 30, who had not been to church for a long time and was raised Presbyterian and was doing a PhD program at Purdue University. Yay, Purdue. And it was in mathematics, in differential equations and scattering theory, which I have not found which Bible book that's in. So
Mhm.
this young man was decided, I'm going to go back to church. My life, I want to know more about life than scattering theory, where I've spent my whole time, the last 3 years. And when he walks into the door, he is probably the youngest person at that time walking into the door of the church, and he was greeted with great hospitality. People wanted to know his name, and he was handed a volunteer card.
Mm.
And the
Mhm.
card was, "Are you willing?" They said, "We need someone on building and grounds. You probably don't want to work in the nursery, but after worship, if you would circle one of these, just bring it up on the communion table and leave it there." And all good intentions. But what this gentleman he was really trying to make sense of, I'm in this world that seems to have nothing to do with faith and doesn't really relate to the kind of faith formation that I had, like at Bible school when I was 8. And there was no match there. There was no sense of who he was and the kind of life he was trying to make meaning out of, and the kind of formation he would have had, for better or for worse, in a rather traditional looking congregation 10 years before. So that's a story. I'm not sure that answers exactly the question.
Oh, it
yeah,
does.
Story.
yeah. And let me jump in at that point too, because Tim, you're one of the people that I learned from, and I think that the way that you're able to tell those stories and the work you do in the Divergent Church is able to hold up some of these frames. So let me say it a way that you've taught me, and that is that there is a difference between, and this is all around the issues of agenda and agency. And so, that young man walked into the congregation, which was an institution-based congregation, and it held the agenda and the agency for itself. And so they said to this young fellow, if you're going to be with us, you have to help us with our issues. And we'll be the ones who will determine what's important, such as our buildings and grounds and so forth. When in fact, what that young man was doing was trying to act on his own agenda and agency to say, I would like to know more about my world and put it in perspective according to my experience. Okay, so the thing that I really appreciate about the Divergent Church is that underneath all of that, these are congregations that are learning how to give the agenda and agency away. They give it to the people that are in their community and say that, what's important to you is important to us. Let us work on it together, and so forth. Is that a fair way of thinking about this?
It's a very fair way. And it, first of all, it interprets exactly what I think was going on with the young man, and the categories fit really well. And so I think it shows the categories around agency, so forth, that you've identified fit that story really well. When it comes to Divergent Church, again, thank you for reading my writing more carefully than I write it. So one of the things in Divergent Church is that there are practices that I think are part of, first of all, they're part of all of humanity, but they have particular expressions that at least historically have had in Christian communities. So the practice of artistic expression. So there's a congregation featured in Divergent Church in which there is the congregation, there's preaching, there's teaching, there's pastoral care, there's engagement with the community, but there's this other great thing in the room, if you will. And so in this congregation, it just so happens, there's lots of artists in this church.
Mm-hmm.
The church I served in Xenia, Ohio, there were a lot of teachers, just lots of teachers. Now, not every church may say, oh, we have a lot of teachers or we have a lot of artists. But this particular congregation, the great third thing in this room, God, Christ, the people, were different opportunities to express their faith and their lives through artistic expression. A lot of drama, that is theater, a lot of artistic expressions in terms of images. And so the meaning making of faith came through that which most interested a large part population of the congregation.
It's I think, a helpful, very practical and real example of that shift of agenda and agency. And not entirely. Like, in other words, the institution is still doing the things that the institution feels called to do. And because of who was in the room, giving a bit of that agenda and agency that that their neighbor congregation might not be seeing as their agenda, this art and bringing art to life in whatever ways they were doing it, but really letting the giftedness of people shift, if you will, the agenda a little bit of that congregation. So I really, that's a really helpful example. I want to draw on that notion of agency and agenda, and say, and then pull on one of Gil's concepts that he uses. He draws on this notion of a liquid culture, right? That, in other words, problems morph faster than we can solve them. Change is happening more rapidly than we can attend to change. And so I'm thinking of that and saying, when we shift agenda and agency in the midst of so much change, that can actually feel like the congregation's getting the rug pulled out from under them.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that Gil has driven home is how important it is for congregations to hold on to their identity and purpose in the midst of that kind of fluidity and change. So back to agency, and if we're still following here, agency and agenda, if there's some giving away of that, how do congregations still hold their identity and purpose, even as they give some of that agency and agenda away?
Just one thing I'm interested. So thank you for the segues being consistent, Lisa. I'm curious about. I always know that Gil's very careful about language, so I'm interested in the choice of liquid.
Yeah, that was not my choice. That was a Polish sociologist. This is the language of the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. And he's looking at the much larger cultural shift in terms of how fast does change happen. And he's really making the argument that it's very difficult for anybody to respond to change at its current pace if you want to be orderly. And in some sense, that means that, if you come up with a solution to whatever your problem is, there's a startup phase and then the implementation phase. And by the time you've worked that kind of stuff through, everything has changed again. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that, we need to pay attention to purpose and identity. The adage that comes out of systems work would be to say that in order to be resilient to that kind of change, you have to be very, very steady in purpose, but flexible in strategy. Okay. So now when you're talking about practice, this is one of the things that I find myself hearing from you. And again, I'm testing because, you and I often go back with language like this. So one of the things that I'm hearing from you is that when we're talking about practice, it's not necessarily about how we consistently keep doing everything the same way. In other words, we have to have ushers that come down at a certain time and everybody. That's not practice. Practice has to do with the discipline by which we are ourselves in faith. Is that doable language for you?
Gilly, again, yeah, thanks for reading and listening carefully. So practice is very much life-focused as opposed to inward institutionally focused in terms of the church itself. And so the church has means of grace, at least from my tradition, Presbyterian tradition, and there's probably other traditions that use that phrase. Yeah. In terms of preaching, teaching, care of souls, I like to add community engagement to that. And from those, hopefully, there are certain virtues that people are formed in. And then those virtues lead or are an impulse for people as they live their faith day to day to shape certain practices in life, like vocation is a practice. And then this whole subset of different kinds of vocations. Hospitality is a practice, but it's not necessarily like hospitality of making sure people know where the fellowship hall is.
Right.
It's hospitality even as you maybe host an exchange student in your home. And so the morphine needs for me the reason why it's important to catch up is life is changing so quickly. And for Christian practices to have meaning, they have to stay in sync. I'm not sure what the right phrase is, but they have to be meaningful in the particular context.
Yeah. Well, and the argument that I make in the paper, and that I think is a long-term argument for many of us, is that the traditional voluntary association form of congregation has really outlived its life in our culture. The congregation is just about the last institution left that tries to practice that form. And we've been doing it for 250 years. So, I mean, it's a hard habit to break. But if a congregation is going to make it in this new religious landscape, I think that what we're all saying here is that the congregation first has to know itself and what its gifts are and what its practice is, so that it can go out into the world and be themselves. Because there's no way they're going to invite people into where they are. That time has passed. So it's a matter of them knowing who they are as they go out and be with others. Again, I'm kind of saying these not as if these are conclusions, but again, testing the ideas and testing the language to say, is there something here that can help a congregation think deeply about who it is and what it's trying to accomplish and how it can be authentically itself while it does it?
Lisa and Gil, here's something I've observed. It may not be correct, because it has a bit of a bias, because it has to do with the congregation I attend. So the congregation I attend in the monographs types would be the traditional congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And it is high. This particular congregation is highly vulnerable to failing. There's 80 in worship. As I sit there, I don't think it will be a functioning congregation in 10 years. It might be 5 years. It might be 15 years. But I also think that congregation, in a kind of upside down and backwards way, does know who it is. And it knows who it is in a variety of ways. The preaching and teaching is very faithful. Sometimes what I would call edgy. I think, whoa, this pastor is more courageous than I am. And there's all kinds of wonderful things happening in worship in terms of acceptance of people whose personality and life certainly doesn't fit some sort of a capitalistic mainstream of being funneled into certain jobs, and that's how you live your life. They may be lacking some in what I would call robust community engagement. But for me, there's something, and it's not going to be able to morph. It's going to lose. And it is. It's going to close in 10 to 15 years. But there's still something vibrant about it. And I think that it's even more vibrant in its decline than it would have been 10 years ago, when it would have been, the Presbyterian Church with 300 people and good at the presbytery and so forth. So I don't know if it becomes more real as it gets closer to death. I don't know. Or it's let go of trying to be what society thinks it should be. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I think these are the kinds of stories that remind us that congregations are in all kinds of places, within themselves. And I remember a consultation I did one time in which, again, it was a similar situation where they had enough attendance and they had enough energy to keep going, but they were not sustainable at all. And so we came up with either 4 or 5 scenarios, I forget, that if you do this, you might be able to get this much more, energy for your ministry, but it will cost you this. And that was the kind of conversation. Well, one of the scenarios was that they do nothing. And we said, in that scenario, this will not get you any more time than you already have, but it will bring comfort to you because you won't ask anything more of yourself. However, the cost you're going to pay is to watch more and more of your members disappear through death or by having to move away with their age. And you're going to experience all that will happen as your congregation decays around you. So, I mean, we said that there was a cost to this. And to a person, they all chose that scenario. Okay. So, it isn't as if there's this thing that all congregations have to do. I mean, you can't do more than who you are and what you are, and they have to make those kinds of choices. But I do believe that, and I'll play this one out because I think it's another area that Lisa and I wanted to kind of explore with you. A lot of our congregations have simply have to be careful here because that's a reductive way of looking at it. A lot of congregations have chosen their current way of being a Sunday-only institution. And one of the things that means is that the worship experience is the central experience that everybody gathers around, and that is who they are. That is perhaps their only practice. Okay. Now, what people forget is that this primacy of Sunday morning worship is relatively new to the American Christian congregation. That before that, they were a Sunday school group, and that there were whole periods of time in which everybody in the community came to Sunday school because they would talk a little bit about faith, but they would visit with each other and they would form community. And then when worship started, 2/3 of them would go home because they were focused on a different practice. Okay, ours has become worship centered, and I'm finding that it's hard for a lot of our congregations to think beyond that singular practice. They can't see themselves as saying that can be part of our practice, but we can also do these things. Does that make sense to describe it that way?
And when you say practices, we're talking about sort of the activities of Sunday or the weekend experience, but we're also talking about all the sort of faith formation eggs, if you will, are put in that basket, right? That's really understanding that's the means through which we are forming Christians, forming faith.
And if I'm tracking Gil and Lisa, it's the observation that worship as the exclusive, and that's probably pushing it too far. Maybe primary is being the example of what church is or a congregation is, and all that goes into it in terms of actually also forming people's like my life, your life. That is an adaptation that congregations are an adaptation or a change that happened 250 years ago. That's a pretty long time.
It is.
Has ultimately caught up with at least the culture and context that we're in right now.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways we've talked about it is, sort of the center of gravity has shifted away from Sunday to every day. Or maybe that's, I mean, I think that's what the map says. If you kind of go from the perspective of meaning making, it's how am I seeking meaning and purpose and belonging every day in my life, not just one day a week or not just through. So it's the center of gravity is on Sunday, but it's also through the building in a way. I mean, and the institution or the organizational structure of the church. And it's moving beyond the walls, and it's moving to the sort of everyday lived experience of how am I a flourishing human who's in connection with other people, and so I'm curious, Tim, if you've seen some of these divergent congregations that you've met with, if they have or how they have maybe shifted that center of gravity outside the walls or away from Sunday morning. Like, are there things you're seeing in some of these contexts?
Sure. So most of them, the examples that I would share, or the stories that I would share, would be having to do with community engagement or social justice or some form. And I don't think this is surprising, but I think it's really healthy the outward focus within the local community, and then the context of the local community influencing the congregation more than the congregation shaping the local community or the local context. This isn't a story that represents some sort of structure around that, because I find that it starts like unfolding liquid with no structure. I don't mean no, that's an exaggeration. But I'm with a pastor. I'm white. The pastor's black, and is clergy person in Indianapolis. I'm out to lunch with this pastor, and we're at the Olive Garden. This was a few years back. I don't know if Olive Garden's still a franchise. So, right. Speaking of changing culture,
That's right. That's right.
so everyone there knows him. I mean, it's just like everybody at this Olive Garden knows him, and they all address him as pastor. Anyway, we're going back to the church. He's driving. There's two young men who are fighting in the street. I mean, it's fisticuffs. They're one around the neck and fists flying. Pastor gets out of the car, and he does say to me, "Stay in the car." But I think it was partly for my safety, but also because I'd mess it up, what he was about to do. And so he goes out there. They stop. Pastor's there. I'm watching. I don't know the words. I'm watching a 5-minute conversation. And at the end, the two men shake hands. And the pastor comes back and is in the car with me, and he turns to me and he says, "That's ministry." And it's a simple story, and it there's much more I don't know quite the right words, because I was about to say that's more robust in terms of what I'm thinking in terms of community engagement. And this congregation does real robust engagement with their community, or the community with the congregation. But just that phrase that out in the streets, showing my age, there's an old Doobie Brothers album called "Taking It to the Streets."
Right.
And that's what that pastor did. And then he gets in the car and he goes, "That's ministry." He's not speaking from the pulpit. He's not at the baptismal. I mean, they're literally in the streets. And so that's a mini example of congregations taking all kinds of things on larger scales out into the street. And really what's really happening is the streets teaching the gospel.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I may, I'd like to push that a little bit. And this is going back into some of the recesses of remembering, because it was a study that was done, I'm going to guess, in 1967 or 68. So we're really reaching back. And it was a study of Reformed and conservative Jews. And one of the primary questions was, what does it mean to be an observant Jew? Now, very much within the conservative movement, but overwhelmingly in the Reform movement, the answer that came back that to be an observant Jew means to have an observant rabbi. Now, what that means is that I'm a good Jew if my rabbi follows all of the observances, or dietary observances, and the weekly, daily practices in your right. So that I'm a good Jew if I am connected. Okay, so the dilemma for me is that so many of our congregations, and I think even the congregation that I'm part of, is doing well, mainly because we are living off of the energy and the engagement of a really effective clergy person. And so how do you help the congregation say that this isn't something that we go to worship on Sunday so that our pastor can do ministry, instead of saying, where are we in this ministry, and how do we use our practices to make the difference in the community and make ourselves part of that? There was another piece I wanted to get at, and maybe I will come back to it. But do you hear that difference in terms of? I know the other part about that. Was it the religious landscape, as I was trying to describe it there, is not a Sunday, Sabbath, or sacred thing where you go to a place and you care for meaning in that hour or 2 hours. These are people who go to Soul Cycle to be inspired, or to find community, and then they'll go to the art museum to find some awe in their lives, and they'll put all those pieces together. They actively work at this, whether they are intentional in thought about it. But it's an ongoing process. How do we help our congregations accept an ongoing process? If this is making sense.
Sure, I'm tracking the observance of the clergy person. One of the things that is very inviting about the congregation I attend, and I may have referred to as the pastor's a wonderful preacher. So first of all, I'm thinking not all great preachers are in huge churches,
Right.
but through the preaching and the teaching and the practices of this particular minister, I can see very well. I mean, I'm drawn to this human being. And so I can really track what was being observed about those who were being looked at as observant Jews and how that may have been lived out through the rabbi in many different ways. The piece about I guess I want to in some and I in conversations with you, Gil, the word transcendence as part of the meaning making has come up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm interested in hearing from you about how transcendence in an overt Christian or congregational setting and the transcendence that one may experience by their favorite Netflix movie. My favorite movie of all times is The Perks of Being a Wallflower. If you want to learn about my teenage years, just watch that.
Okay.
Well, almost watch it. There's some fun that happens there that I never had. Anyway, but it actually ends with the how am I getting off on The Perks of Being a Wallflower? But it
No, but stay with it, Tim. Stay with it. Yeah, it's good.
well, I thank you, because the very end scene has the lead character having an experience where the lead character says, there's a lead up sentence and it says, and at this very moment, I know that I am infinite.
Mm.
So the movie ends with what seems to be a kind of experience of transcendence. And I'm almost done with this movie, which is a great book too. The family are observant Catholics, and it's portrayed in a very positive way for the family. It doesn't go deep, but it's portrayed as something that's helpful to this family. So there's this experience in church, which in the movie is portrayed as positive, and then there's this end scene. He's actually in the back of a pickup truck through a tunnel in Pittsburgh, and he says, "I am infinite." So I'm just interested in what you make of that in terms of transcendence.
Well, yeah, okay. So I'm an organizational guy, and so a lot of that comes back to exactly what I was saying before. That if a congregation holds on to its own agenda and agency, it denies itself transcendence.
Mm.
It can't bring into itself or expose itself to something that goes beyond that agenda and that agency.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's one of the crippling effects of being institutional for too long. That we've always known that, the longer any organization lives, the more that its mission becomes internalized and it becomes about, the organization itself. To be transcendent means to let that stuff go and to open yourself to something that is beyond who you are and more than who you are and all that goes with that. And so I think that it's a hard move for many established congregations now. I think really good preachers, and we talked about this, and we'll talk about this with some of our other interviewees, that in some sense, they're a good preacher can make that transcendent moment available to other people at an individual level. But I think it's harder for the organization itself to do that if it's really well established. And again, tell me if I'm being fair here or not, but I think that transcendence as an organization is a difficult issue.
All of the references, I think, that I've made so far to the congregation I attend have to do with me, individual.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Hopefully not being egotistical, but
No.
they've been about my experience in that congregation, which I think reinforces what you just said, Gil.
Yeah. Well.
So if a church, a congregation, an organizational structure, an institutional structure like the church, like a congregation, is going to really do this work. You all both talk about contextual creativity, like innovation arises from within a community rather than like stealing from somebody else's idea. Like if it's really going to take hold, which I think is part of what you're talking about, this transcendence, like it's allowing for the Holy Spirit to move and paying attention to the Holy Spirit as opposed to somehow owning all the agency and agenda, as you say, in a way that actually keeps us from allowing that contextual creativity and innovation to flourish within the congregation. So I'm curious about as we work with leaders, as we think about how leadership has been, do good worship and good preaching and visit your folks. But if leadership right now is actually giving away the sort of or sharing the agency and the agenda and really allowing for that space for the transcendence, what does that look like? And how do leaders need to be formed in maybe different ways in this moment? What are the implications for the work of a leader today?
Could I jump in on this one? And
Please,
again,
I'm asking both of you.
Yeah,
Here we are.
And as Tim was doing before, sometimes the best way to get at this is by telling the story. And the story here comes from a friend who was a executive presbyter in the Detroit area, where there was a part-time church that had a rather large church building, and they had a manse, next to it. But they had shrunk down to the point that they only had, I think, a quarter-time pastor. And they were kind of just eking along. But there was this plot of land in between the manse, the parsonage, and the building. And one of the members went to the board and said, may I have that for use? Because I'd like to start a vegetable garden, and we'll use those vegetables to help with our community. So they said yes. And then the woman got together a bunch of volunteers, and she taught them in two different ways. One group of volunteers was to work the garden and to grow the vegetables, and the other group of volunteers was trained to give the vegetables away on Saturday morning to anybody who came. And they made a thing about they all came. And what she trained the people who gave the vegetables away in was asking questions like, how long have you lived here? What do you really enjoy about this neighborhood? And what do you worry about most? That was the big question she was always asked. So they just, for, a whole season, just ask all these questions. What are you worried about? And then they found out that what most people were most worried about was the education of their young people, because their young people were not doing well in school. And they were not moving on to college, and they were left, in a place where there was no employment and all that stuff. So what this congregation did was not to try to solve the problem. They said, we have a building where people can meet, and we know a lot of people who are worried about this. And we know there's a college that's teaching teachers that probably ought to be paying attention. So they started hosting just gatherings. And they didn't try to lead the meetings. They simply said, you're here because we all share this same worry. What do you all want to do about that? And if you want to do something, we'll let you use our building, and we're going to try to help you, but we don't have an answer. Okay. They gave the agenda away. They gave the agency to the people who it belonged to. And through that, there was, a lot of energy going around. And like everybody likes to know, the attendance went up. Okay. And then when I checked in with my friend, I said, how's it still going? He said, well, they got a new quarter-time pastor who was really, kind of deeply trained in jazz as sacred music. So they began to have jazz vesper services. And the preacher really liked it, and the attendance went down.
I didn't expect this. You got me. I didn't know once
Oh,
you
is that
mentioned
right?
jazz, I didn't think the story was going to go that way.
I know you and I would have gone, but they didn't.
Yeah, right.
But do you hear, that radical giving away and only bringing to the table the stuff that you actually have?
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
So, Lisa and Gil, I don't know that I can go quite as deep in the exegesis that Gil just did, but two things. Two perhaps seemingly disconnected things come to me. One is that I think at some point I talked about that the very nature of faith itself, I think, is changing, which has something to do with the landscape of congregations and this morphing that hasn't caught up. That I do think there's a part of Scripture that can be wonderfully wild and woolly that could be helpful, and that is the parables of Jesus. They've been so domesticated into wisdom sayings. The early bird gets the worm, or some Hallmark card. And when I look at the interpreters like David Buttrick or Brandon Scott and others, they just pull apart these parables and just they're things that would get someone crucified, the same. And so to recover what I think are the real and authentic ways in which Jesus meant those parables, I think could be very formative to people who are seeking to belong in a way that they're not able to belong in any other community. And it's from the shape of the parables that I think new ways of belonging can come out of the group itself. The last thing I'll say about parables is, so I can't prove this. This comes from I'm not a seminary professor, but I'm trying to be one here for a minute.
A minute.
Yeah, a minute. Keep me to that, Lisa. That John Dominic Crossan has this. He just says all this stuff, and I don't check his footnotes. Anyway, he describes that given first century rabbis, they hold discussions. They have this sense of unlimited conversation around, say, the parables. So the Gospels capture the parable. This man was walking along this road, he was robbed, etc. And then the first century rabbi would say, the kingdom of heaven is like, Jesus tells the parable. And it's captured briefly in some of the Gospels, the first century rabbi would say, so what is the kingdom of God like? And then the conversation would go anywhere. The rabbi would host this conversation and give away the parable. And so if Jesus, in a sense, was a rabbi, what we have captured in the Gospels is Jesus telling the story, or the memory of the community of Jesus telling the story. But the Gospels don't capture the conversation that took place afterwards.
Right.
And so I guess now I'm coming around that somehow giving away the conversation to a group of people who have a sense of belonging and something at risk in their own lives is really very gospel-like. And Gil, you taught me this form of being together in a group where there's this great thing in the room and people are lightly facilitated around this great thing. And the facilitator may summarize a little bit of what is heard, and then the facilitator disappears behind this thing in the room. And the conversation is totally given to the people in the room. So
Right.
it's sort of like, well, what does mental health care look like in this community? and they just go for it. And that's where things start become not information and training, but education, drawing something new out, and change of form, transformation.
Yeah.
I love talking about the parables. Thank you.
There you go. There you go. But you also like making that difference between the training and the education. And that's really key.
Not just information, but transformation.
Right.
And I so appreciate the power of story, not as the summary of events, but rather something that actually launches new insight and transformation and conversation, right? The difference between, recapping what happened to, you called Gil's story exegesis. It just opened up all kinds of visuals and possibilities there and such.
Yeah.
So thank you for that and the way that you use story so well. Okay, so we have a final question that we are asking all of our guests, and we're to that moment. So, so here's the question, Tim. What's one practice or perspective that helps you stay grounded and open to God's new thing in this season?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Lisa, and for such a grounding question. One of the things I think about as I answer is that they're largely individualistic, but let me go anyway. Okay, this is my first attempt. If you ask me tomorrow, I'll have a different answer. But my practice of prayer has been becoming more important to me, and it has to do with a conversation I had with a, a gentleman that has meant a lot to me through the years, who recently lost his wife, but he was telling me how important prayer was to him, and I'm thinking it should be really important to me, and I have a hard time sitting still. So I like to practice moving prayers. So like if I'm in the car and I'm thinking of somebody, or I pass a church. So I'm not a brilliant prayer. I have a lot to learn about prayer. I need some training and information about it. But the practice of prayer has been really important to me in terms of being grounded and open to God's new things in life. As a minister, and this goes back to something that we were talking about, I've been preaching more recently, probably because my role at the center is changing and will be changing. And so this goes back to perhaps the observant leader. But I learn a lot about faith and congregational life and my own practices of staying grounded and open to God's new things through preaching. And I am interested all of a sudden now as the individualistic model and the role of the pastor is coming out just in these things, in these answers. And I just really love to see moments of grace and gratitude. This little church, we're done with stories, but I just carry with me. Like every day I'm holding in my heart these beautiful small things that are happening in this congregation. And that keeps me so grounded. And yeah, this goes to belonging. At phase of life I'm in, reconnecting with old friends. Those don't sound like things that are going to save the world, but
No, they're beautiful.
They do. They do.
Yeah.
Then maybe they save the world one person at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tim. Every time we're in a conversation with you, I hear new insights to maybe words we have used or thrown around, and I pay more attention to them because of how you examine, but also how you tell stories. And so I'm grateful for you, your leadership, and your friendship over the years. Thank you.
You're most welcome, Lisa. And my wife, Gretchen, great veterinarian, wonderful mother, wonderful spouse. She always she does this. She always asks me at the end of the day, what's the best conversation you had on a certain day? Well, I just had it. So thank you very much.
Oh.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks. It's good to be with you again, as always.
Thanks, Gil.
Yep.